I'm going to be talking about lines or little passages from the reading in the children's literature book specifically. So on page 150, when talking about contemporary realistic fiction, it says, "For many children, this is their reality, and sugarcoating it or denying it is unrealistic, even disrespectful." And so to me, that makes me really think, and we've talked about this before in previous classes, but that we really, really do need to be looking at the demographics of our students when selecting, especially realistic fiction books, because they need to be able to read these books and connect to them, have those things to kind of look to that it shows the experiences that they're having, not just what their peers may be having. Um, on page 152, it one of the parameters that it sets for being contemporary realistic is that it's set in the present and could really happen, which makes sense, contemporary and realistic. My question though is, what happens when books kind of age out of the present? Not necessarily so far that we would classify it as historical fiction, but to a point where it's not, or some aspects of it, I guess I should say, are not as relevant anymore. Like if we look at a book like The Babysitter's Club, um, where first off they have this club of babysitters, and I honestly just even letting preteens and teenagers babysit that you don't know babysit your children is kind of not crazy realistic anymore. But there's, part of the whole thing is they have their own private landline in Christy's room. Well, landline, I don't know anybody that has a landline anymore outside of businesses. And even some of that, it's just cell phones. So that kind of, it's not so old that I would call that historical fiction, as it's not set around some big historical time, but it's not really contemporary anymore. But it still is that realistic, it has that realistic element to it. So I don't know. I'm just throwing that out there. What happens when they kind of start to age out, but not to the point where it's historical. Um, on page 155, this includes searching for a sense of self, exploring one's place inside and outside of the nuclear family, and coping with the growing importance of relationships with friends. So, to me, that really just says coming of age, even though we're not looking maybe at the age level that at least I typically think of, which would be more of the teenagers. Um, it's still that finding that sense of self, um, and coming into their own, which is real important for kids to see and read these things, to know they're not the only ones going through the things that they're going through. Which, I mean, we've all been through that time. We know it can feel that way, like no one understands you, no one's ever been through this, and it's the worst thing that's ever going to happen in your life. And seeing that these experiences really are pretty normal, and that people do go through this and it's all okay, is really um, important for those kids. Okay, 162. This was one that I hadn't thought about it, but it makes sense. Um, this is the genre that may be subject to more book challenges, because it can and should deal with some of those more controversial topics, like some people would call it controversial and some wouldn't, but divorce, um, that kind of growing up, having crushes and likes and those things that some people might say is not appropriate, for younger readers, but it happens. It's still relevant to them, and so whether it's considered appropriate or not, I wouldn't say it's so extreme that it's not appropriate. It happens, and they need to see that. They need to be able to connect themselves to those things, because that's real. That's what's realistic in this perfect world where nothing, divorce never happens, no one ever has crushes that aren't returned, and all. That's not realistic, and it doesn't feel genuine. Um, it's not a book, and it's not at all realistic, but the Pixar movie Turning Red kind of makes me think of that. It's for the older kids, not like my son's 7, not really his age, but older. I know people were really up in arms about it when it came out because I haven't seen it, but there was an issue, or there was a thing in it where her mom was bringing her pads or tampons or something, and people were so upset about how they could include that and yada yada yada. But it's about a 12-year-old, maybe teenage, kind of early teenage girl, and that's a real thing, and she gets embarrassed by it, which is so real. Oh my gosh, I mean, that's such a real thing. And so kids could relate to that if they're in that age. And so whether it's controversial or not, they need to see that. They need to know that they're not alone with that. On page 164, it was just listing some common authors for contemporary realistic. And one of them that it kind of stuck out to me was Kevin Hanks. We read a lot of his books in second grade. And what's interesting to me, because even though it's realistic, most of his books are about animals, particularly mice. But even though they're animals, they're only animal in shape. They're very humanized, and so it's that realistic. They act in real human ways, and so they get that realism from what and that's younger kids are dealing with and doing. And even though it's mice, they're able to relate to that because they're very similar to them. So moving on to historical fiction, on page 190, a well-written historical fiction contains compelling characters, engaging plots, and meaningful themes. So really, even though it's set in some historical time, it's just as much about a good story as any other fictional book. On page 190, it can supplement the history or social studies curriculum with human stories that bring events to life. So, like we've talked about multiple times in multiple different classes at this point, it'd be a really great opportunity for collaboration between the librarian and the classroom teacher. Page 191, really the whole first paragraph, kind of going to what I was talking about a minute ago with what happens when contemporary becomes not quite so contemporary. And you really need to kind of think about what the reader would consider historical when seeing, because there's not necessarily a time frame of like suddenly 1990 is historical. I mean, there's not really that time frame like that. And so you need to think about what the typical reader would consider historical. My second graders would consider 1994, really, not even that, what's considered 2000 historical. I was in kindergarten in 2000, so anything that would happen then, I mean, they would think that was historical. And that might be historical fiction, which hurts me a little bit. But that's just, so we need to not think about what we as adults would consider historical, and more what the children would consider historical. Also on page 100, oh, sorry, I skipped something. On page 196, it lists some novels that can be considered good historical fiction, like the Dear America novels, Royal Diaries, My Name is America, those series. A lot of those are diaries, they're diary form. The Royal Diaries, I read some of those when I was in middle school, take actual, usually princesses, and kind of it's like their diary. There's some controversy around them because it could seem like a primary resource. a firsthand account when it is fictional. It's making these things up. But my argument to that would be it's getting kids interested in these things. So they read it and maybe they're interested in they read I can remember one I read was about Princess or Queen Elizabeth the First, and I that really sparked an interest in the Tudors for me that I still have. um and so I'll come back and forth on that interest, but I'll get in a kick and remember that book and want to research and find more stuff out. And so even if it's not totally historically accurate, because we don't really know exactly what Elizabeth was thinking and stuff during her childhood, um, it can spark that interest in history. Also on page 196, historical picture books are worth sharing with young readers. The author does say that they don't think, and they're probably right, that kids below age like 8 can really get the historical part of historical fiction. I will say we've got in our reading curriculum in my second grade class, part of embedded in it is our science and social studies. And so we just finished a unit on immigration. And there's some historical fiction books about children immigrating to America. And there's one, it's called Geetle's Journey. She's immigrating from Russia to America, goes through Ellis Island, all this interesting things. And my kids really get into it and they really are interested. And we look up Ellis Island and what they had to go through. And Geetle is 8, I think, maybe 9, about my kid's age. And we talk about how she has to come on her own. And could you even imagine you having to go on a ship for weeks without anyone you know, so people who don't even speak your language, going somewhere that you don't know the people, you don't know where you're going. And it really, I do think, kind of opens up their minds a little bit, but that's just me.